Hey guys, Tarithal here. It is the night before Mythic Plus is released for Season 1 of The War Within, and I'm just feeling inspired to make a YouTube video on my opinion of each of the dungeons. I thought in this video what I would do is I'd rank them from my favorite to least favorite dungeon for the season. Obviously, this is just my opinion, it's based off of my testing on the beta. There might be some dungeon tuning, this opinion may change, but just my initial thoughts going into Season 1. I'm not going to spend a lot of time editing this video. Some of my prior videos I spent a lot of time editing, but I'm just going to kind of ramble here and give you my thoughts and take it or leave it. And yeah, let's get on to it. So right away, I guess one takeaway is that even the dungeon that I think I would rate the highest as my most favorite for the season probably would land somewhere like midway through a list in a good season. I don't think any of these dungeons are particularly good. My favorite, which I guess I'll talk about here in a second, is probably the Stone Vault, and everything else after that is not so great. Not so great. I guess that's the trade-off of having a system where the dungeons rotate every season, but I think you're going to run into a season every once in a while where just, you have 8 stinkers, and unfortunately, I think most of the dungeons this time around just really aren't that enjoyable. And some of that's probably just the overall design of, what Blizzard has re-envisioned for Mythic Plus, and it's just a bunch of small polls, all the casters recast, even if you do stops on them, they're just constantly recasting. There's definitely a higher level of communication that needs to be done in each of the dungeons, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I, for one, am definitely someone that enjoys hard content. So by no means, maybe I'll end up enjoying the season more than, initially I'm thinking here. But going into Season 1, I guess here are the dungeons that I think I'm going to enjoy the most, and yeah, I'll give my thoughts for each of them. Okay, my favorite dungeon for the season, the Stone Vault. So the Stone Vault, regardless of which role, and I did test on tank, healer, and DPS, this dungeon is difficult. The bosses are difficult, but they're rewarding. They've got patterns to them, and once you figure out the patterns, each of the bosses in the dungeon are pretty enjoyable, maybe minus the last boss, but just the design of, I guess, the bosses is what really drives this dungeon to be fun for me. And in between the bosses, you just get to do a bunch of big pulls. I guess one of the negative feedbacks I would give is just the amount of curses that go out. And so at the start of the beta, some of the mobs apply curses to your party that tick pretty hard. And if you're a healer, it's pretty frustrating, especially if you don't have anyone that can dispel the curses. This dungeon can be pretty frustrating, but since then, they took away the windup of the cast, and so people just get curses and there's nothing you can do about it. That part of the dungeon is still pretty frustrating, but outside of that, there's a lot of tank damage that goes out, but it's just, you can do a lot of big pulls, and it seems pretty fair overall. And it's one of the few dungeons where you can just still pull large. The bosses are generally fun, and overall, it seems like a pretty good short dungeon. So that's probably the reason why I think this is the number 1 on my list. And yeah, not much more to say on that. All right, number 2 on my list, I have Mythic Scythe as the second most enjoyable dungeon of the season. And this dungeon's a little frustrating with some of the changes that they made, but honestly, I think had they not made the changes, this would have been basically the free dungeon for the season. This would have been like your Shadow Moon Burial Grounds or like your Azure Vault that you would always run for a reroll. It wasn't particularly challenging. It definitely is more challenging now, but I think it's in line with basically the rest of the dungeons for the season. Not necessarily, I don't necessarily agree that they added more fun to the dungeon, but they definitely made it more in line with the difficulty scale of what you can expect with the rest of the dungeons. This is probably number 2 on my list. There's definitely some vibes to it. I definitely like how this dungeon feels in general. Just the atmosphere is nice. It's just good old Mist. If you're going back to Shadowlands and you're doing Mythic Scythe again, not much feels different. The maze, obviously, the mobs do a little bit different mechanics, but overall it's the same atmosphere. It's just your nice chill Mist. In a season where I don't think any of the dungeons are particularly fun, this one's at least, it reminisces its former Shadowlands counterpart, and it's still an enjoyable experience. And I think the worst thing that could happen to Mythic Scythe was either, having a 7-minute first boss, which I don't think will be the case this season. They've toned down the tyrannical scaling pretty hard, or running to the dragon, which can still happen. But other than that, it's still the same old Mist. So it's a little bit more difficult, but overall, I think it keeps the same vibe. And yeah, Misaturna Scythe probably still up there as one of the better dungeons. Okay, third on this list, I have City of Threads. This dungeon, when it was first released on beta, I threw a fit. I thought this was the worst dungeon they ever created. The spy minigame was just terrible. You know, there wasn't really a pattern when it first came out to where the spies spawn. It wasn't very intuitive. You spend 5 minutes right in the middle of the dungeon just running around aimlessly trying to find the spy. But now that we figured that out in kind of the pattern and order and that happens, this dungeon is really not too bad. The bosses are all fun. Each of the bosses very fair, predictable patterns, not too difficult. Probably the last boss is the most difficult in the dungeon, but even that it's quite fun. It's very predictable. There's quite a big healing check. If you're a healer and you don't like healing checks, you won't enjoy this dungeon. But I think, you know, if you're someone that really enjoys a challenge, all the bosses are very enjoyable. You can pull pretty big at the beginning and the end. There's nothing that's really too unfair in this dungeon. And yeah, overall, just a nice quick in and out. I think the success rate in this dungeon is going to be quite high this season, which is probably adding to, you know, the fun factor of it. But yeah, overall, City of Threads, not too bad. I have it up there as number 3. All right, number 4 on my list, I have the Necrotic Wake. If you haven't played this since Shadowlands, they move some mobs around, they change some of the weapons. Overall, it still feels pretty much like the old Necrotic Wake. In fact, they probably made it feel more like the old Necrotic Wake than it has been all through beta cycle just this week, because they took out a lot of the mechanics and they just kind of added them all back in last second. So yeah, this feels pretty much how the old Necrotic Wake felt. There's a lot of stuff in here that's now pretty overtuned. Hopefully they fix pretty soon, or else this dungeon is going to be kind of a nightmare for most people. They changed how some of the mobs give count, especially if you recall, like the gatekeepers used to give 0 count whatsoever. They give pretty good count now, but they also just jacked up the scaling, man. Like every time they do their AoE, you just have to do like infinite healing now to keep up. And so they definitely added some value to pulling some of the higher risk mobs, and they also moved some of the mobs around. But it should be a pretty good dungeon overall. The timers, it was free throughout the beta cycle, but you know, very last second they ended up changing a million things. You need more count now, and of the count that you need, you have to pull more difficult trash mobs, and so it's kind of TBD to see how difficult this dungeon ends up being. But third boss too, the Stitchwork guy, like the surgeon that throws the meat hook, that got jacked up a lot too. There's just a lot of passive AoE damage that goes out, so I think you're gonna need to bring a really strong healer to this dungeon now. But it feels a lot like the old Necrotic Wake, which, you know, if you knew how to do it back then, it's pretty much the same dungeon now. So just bring a good healer, and I think you'll have a good time. Okay, 5th on my list, I have the Dawnbreaker. So the Dawnbreaker, when it was first released on beta, was extremely buggy. You could, for example, me playing Evoker, I could rescue people through the ship, and we could just permanently get stuck inside the ship. I've got a clip of me dying and just like respawning on someone's back and not being able to play the game. Like they were like carrying around my dead body, and yeah, just a bunch of bugs. There's a lot of things within the dungeon that can just globally kill you. If you end up dying and then respawning, you know, a mechanic literally 300 yards away can just randomly kill you as you're trying to get back to your team. And so deaths in this dungeon definitely snowball out of control. But overall, after playing this dungeon, you know, probably 30, 40 times, you kind of get the feel of where you're supposed to go, what the trash mobs do. And the timer in here is actually quite free, assuming that you just don't let yourself chain die and snowball the dungeon out of control. But this dungeon probably has one of the more lenient dungeon timers. And assuming that you're pulling the trash that we're pulling on beta, it's mostly a lot of tank damage. There's a couple of dots that go on people that cause the healer to have to do quite high throughput, but the bosses themselves aren't too challenging. Assuming you can get through the trash easily, there's only a couple packs that you need to pull. Most of your trash is done within the church. Overall, the dungeon's not too bad. Myself, I guess I'm kind of indifferent about the flying in dungeons. I kind of wish maybe the dungeon itself, you were just traversing through the actual city itself on the ground. Maybe they could have set it up that way instead of having to fly around, but I don't know. Some of my friends that enjoy the dungeon for more of like the RPG elements really like it. And I think if you're someone that enjoys the RPG elements and maybe not necessarily like the competitive elements of the dungeon, Dawnbreaker is probably right in the middle of where I put the dungeons for this season in terms of fun. So yeah, for me it's probably fifth on my list, but yeah, it's not the worst dungeon for this season, but it's definitely not the best. I think as long as you're not body pulling additional trash or just, you know, snowballing your deaths over and over, overall I think you're going to have an okay experience in here. Okay, moving into sixth on my list, I have Arakara. And I think the reason I probably have this rated so lowly for the season is just the first area. I think the amount of dispels, whether it be the bleed dispels, poison dispels, you know, even at the end of the dungeon, all the bleed dispels, poison dispels, the pulls that root you, all that kind of stuff. I think just crowd control in itself is not that fun. In the amount of time, especially when I'm playing my Evoker, I'm spending basically up until the first boss, half of my globals are just spent dispelling people. I don't think that is very enjoyable. The dungeon itself has a pretty free timer. I think this is probably going to be one of the most easily two-chested timers out of all the dungeons, which, you know, if that's something that increases your fun of a key, I think this is definitely a dungeon that goes up there. But first boss is kind of awkward. The way you have to send your damage, you know, you're kind of splitting your damage between the ads and the boss. I don't think any damage profile outside of like Affliction Lock really works very well there, at least out of the DPS that are performing well coming out of beta. And the trash in the middle section, having to constantly CC the guys from spawning more of the big haulers. I don't think that's necessarily hard, but it's not super fun. Second boss is okay. Last boss is kind of whatever. It's not my favorite, but it's difficult, and having extra poison dispels is helpful. I don't know. I guess I'm just really against having to bring all kinds of poison dispels, bleed dispels, you know, all that kind of stuff. This dungeon is, I'd say it's just kind of annoying. It's okay, but it's annoying. And so there's just nothing really in the dungeon that stands out as being fun to me. None of the bosses are particularly fun. The trash just isn't particularly fun. I guess one of the only things that really sticks out is just the timer is pretty free. Nothing is egregiously bad, other than maybe the dispels, but yeah, it's just overall kind of a bland dungeon. Okay, in the seventh place, I have Siege of Borealis, which honestly I probably could swap interchangeably with Arakara. I think there are different reasons why you could like either of them or dislike either of them. I'd say before I go into my critique of this dungeon, the one thing I do like about Siege of Borealis is that you can pull big, and you have to pull big because there's just infinite trash in this dungeon, and you have to pull almost all of it. And so it is kind of a fun dungeon in the sense that you can just unload your damage profile on just huge packs and huge packs and huge packs. And it's one of the only dungeons like that outside of like Necrotic Wake, where you just have big pulls all the time. And that part of it is fun. Unfortunately, with Siege of Borealis, you're constantly getting gripped into things and displaced, and mobs are running away that you can't do anything about, and they just pull more trash. And there's frontals and groundals with basically invisible particles that you can't see that you have to move out of. There's raiders gripping you into overlaps that you can't avoid. Things ninja pull like crazy. And yeah, it's just, it's a hot mess. The bosses are okay. I guess the first boss and second boss I like a lot better than the last two bosses. Especially the last boss. It's not very enjoyable getting knocked around, and it's very difficult to heal. It's definitely better than it was when it was originally released in BFA, just the last boss specifically. But second boss has a pretty unfortunate overlap too, where it can pick people and put like, it's called artillery spotted or something like that. And it puts void zones on the ground. But if that happens at the same time that it's doing its frontal, the boss's model will actually turn, and you can't really do anything about it, and the boss will just frontal you. I guess my biggest critique with this dungeon is that it seems kind of unfair at times, and it's just frustrating having to deal with the unfairness of the dungeon and not being able to see what killed you half the time. And so once again, you can pull quite large in the dungeon, which is fun, but you're just going to have a lot of deaths in here that are just unfair. And so it definitely goes at the bottom half of my list. Probably in between this and Arakara. You know, some days I like pulling big and doing a lot of damage, and that's cool. Other days I just like having a free timer, which is Arakara. So yeah, probably tied for the 6th, 7th position here, but Siege of Borealis is definitely 7th on my list. So, funny enough, when this dungeon first released on beta, I think this was one of the more chill dungeons. It felt pretty easy to get through. The timer seemed pretty lenient. You couldn't really pull a lot together, but it seemed pretty easy to time and not really much was happening. It just seemed like an overall chill dungeon. But since then, 8th on my list, Scrim Bol. I think every single pack in this dungeon, you need to have assigned kicks and stops. And I feel like the timer is extremely tight and you're just sweating literally the entire time from start to finish. This dungeon is just very technical. There's a lot of curse spells that go out that people get cursed for their entire health pool while an AoE happens, and if you miss a single kick during that period, someone dies. The middle section near the Forge Master, it's kind of the same ordeal, where the golem will do a big AoE, and if a single kick goes off during that overlap, someone dies. The bombing run is kind of a gimmick that may or may not work. You know, later on, people may figure out a way of gaming that for some extra time, but as it stands right now, I'd say outside of like the Forge Master, I don't really enjoy any of the bosses that much. They're all okay. None of them are particularly hard. I think the last bosses can be kind of tricky, especially if you just get kind of bad RNG with the overlap. With the you have to spread out with void zones, and there's tentacles in your way, and it can be kind of frustrating. But yeah, the bosses are kind of mid. The trash is extremely technical and difficult. The timer is very difficult. You need to pull basically the entire dungeon. There's very few things that you can skip, and every single pull that you do has to be pretty small because there's some lethal mechanic that just either one-shots you due to an AoE or someone gets targeted and you have to just power through it with externals. Overall, just kind of a frustrating experience. Just a bunch of overlaps that can kill you. You're constantly fighting on a ledge. But yeah, this is probably my least favorite dungeon right now, which is crazy because it started off being a pretty chill experience, so maybe after some dungeon tuning, this will be a better experience. But as of right now, at the end of beta, this is definitely last on my list. But yeah, there you go. Those are my dungeons in order by how much I've been enjoying them. It's all just personal experience. There's nothing really scientific about this. It's just this trash pack in this dungeon annoyed me, therefore it's lower ranked. You know, your experience may differ, but anyways, I thought some of you might enjoy hearing how I'm enjoying the dungeons, at least coming out of beta. I know the overall vibe of this video is pretty bad, but I do think it will be rewarding when dungeons are timed. The dungeons are very technical. There are no more like free dungeons where there's just giant trash pulls. You get to do your entire kit and not really have to worry about anything. You know, every single trash pack seems impactful. You know, and I think if you are able to coordinate with the team and successfully pull off a high key, you know, this season is going to feel really rewarding. But, you know, for your average Joe that's doing a lot of pugging, you know, I think you're going to expect some pretty harsh environments going forward. So just kind of a heads up with that. But anyways, this is my outlook going forward. And here's kind of what I'm feeling about the dungeons. And let me know if you think differently, if you've been doing any beta testing. You know, maybe after this week you see the video and, you know, something changed, some tuning changed, and the dungeons have changed, and everything just feels different. But anyways, yeah, I'm done rambling. This is how I feel about the dungeons right now. With all that negativity out of the way, I am looking forward to the season. I'm looking forward to getting back to slamming with my friends, and, you know, I am going to have a good time, and I hope you do too. So thanks for watching. Appreciate you watching the video, and I hope to see you out there.